Hey everyone, today we're considering which of DBD's killers would make for the best movie. If a movie were to be made about each of the original killers, which would be a success and which a flop? And what might they look like? Here's our tiers and let's get into it. Starting out with Trapper. Trapper as the poster boy of Dead by Daylight, I could see having great success with his movie, which I think should honestly just be called Dead by Daylight. I think he should take that honor. Evan's story I think would work well, with much of his lore spanning across his life. A key part of his story is his relationship with his father. I could see the story taking place at two key points, one in the early years where he was more sympathetic and attempted to help the Macmillan workers, then a later one where he's his father's enforcer and his father is growing increasingly weak. As we jump between the two timelines, we discover what Evan's father did, how he killed his uncle and mother, the climax of the film being Evan's final dismissal of his father, as he drags him to the basement and kills him after he's just committed the mass cave-in at the mines. You could also add in a bunch of extra slasher type scenes into this, I think, as I think Trapper would have that kind of movie. I could see a movie about Trapper being a pretty big hit, to be honest. Wraith has a very compelling story that holds a lot of tragedy, but also moments of high action and even thriller elements. It is a horror, but less directly, I'd say. His story could potentially be set in the present, with him now as a man working at Autohaven, suspicious of his boss but continuing on regardless, with him having flashbacks back to his life in Nigeria, where he witnessed endless death and horrors, and also killed a number of soldiers in revenge. This climax would be the revelation that he had been crushing people for years in the Wreckers Yard Crusher. A moment of horror and one that breaks Philip, causing him to kill his boss. It's a fairly niche story maybe, but one with definite climactic moments of great tragedy. Possibly more of a cult classic though. This could be called The Algebra of Infinite Night after his tome lore, I like that. Or potentially something simpler like The Bell, or maybe even after a perk name like Shadowborn. That could be a cool one. Billy could find pretty moderate success, I think, as a slasher type of film, but one with a lot more tragedy, or elements of that, with Billy's very tragic backstory. A bit like Texas Chainsaw though, I could see the film largely focusing on the Coldwind Massacre itself, where Billy finally breaks free of his parents' capture and murders them, as well as the sheriff and his deputies, taking over the farm. It could be a hugely satisfying moment after seeing the awful things he went through, but also very tragic knowing that he's become the monster they told him he was. There would be a simplicity to it with the slasher angle, but more of a depth too with the psychological side to it. A Man Named Boy would be a solid title, or you could go for a bit of a TCM knockoff and call it the Coldwind Farm Massacre or something like that. Nurse has quite a bizarre story and one which I don't think would appeal to wider audiences generally. The film could also have underlining hints toward the asylum holding a greater, darker presence though from the entity, which may give it a bit more of a kick and appeal. It would likely be a very close and personal film focusing on the thoughts and feelings of Sally and how they adapt and change as she goes from being a happy, loving wife to her husband to an embittered and broken woman by the end, killing over 50 people. It would likely be a harsh psychological horror, and I could see it getting some cult success maybe. I'd simply call this one Crotus Pren Asylum. Or even The Cleansing of Crotus Pren after her tome lore. Hag has a pretty unique story, but one I could see translating into quite a compelling film, with the hexes being at the center, following the life of Lisa, a girl who uses them to aid her grades in school and impress her friends. She soon discovers their true power, with the main portion of the film taking place during her capture at the hands of the villagers, before the climax and her ultimate sacrifice of her becoming the Hag and living her days in the swamp as a mysterious and creepy tree witch. I could see this getting a good level of success. Of Flesh and Mud is already an amazing title too. Doctor would have an incredibly graphic movie, and it would surely be R-rated considering the amount of horrific things that occur in his lore. For this reason, it definitely would not be a huge success, I think, but could potentially compete with more graphic films out there like Saw or Terrifier. The focus of the story would likely all just take place at the Larry's Black site, and could possibly even be from the perspective of victims coming to the site after being captured and having to endure the Doctor's experiments. It could also just follow Doctor directly and his life and eventual massacre of Larry's. I could see Doctor at most getting some cult success, but his story is largely just a series of graphic scenes, to be completely honest, so yeah, I don't know, this could be a flop too. I'd call this one Overcharge after his perk. Huntress's story could be done from Anna's own perspective, I think, and then potentially shift away once she reaches her adulthood. It could begin with her as a child, raised by her mother in the woods, with tragedy striking when the elk kills her. Anna is left alone and wanders off. We could then switch to some villagers years later who go out into the woods to investigate, only to find a mysterious cabin. One by one they're hunted down by this apex predator, and eventually this Huntress also comes for their town, destroying it and only sparing the girls. This is when, big twist, we discovered the Huntress is Anna. We then see how she's been trying and failing to provide for these girls, trying to bring back that feeling she got with her mother and the life she misses. Her haunting lullaby ringing out throughout the movie. I think this could be a genuine and solid success, and A Lullaby for the Dark is already a perfect title. Clown Story would probably work best from an outside perspective and not from clowns. I could see it focusing on some circus performers who have heard rumors of there being a man who dresses as a clown who kills and takes your fingers. I'm not too sure what the narrative could be though, considering Clown's story is largely just that he travels, kills, and travels more. Maybe it could be a slow discovery within the circus, eventually uncovering who he really is, and ending with Clown fleeing the scene and entering a fog, disappearing forever. I could see this kind of story getting some moderate success maybe as a decently unique horror film idea, especially with its real-world roots that may get many interested in the premise. Curtain Call is a great name as well for the movie, but other good titles could be something more simplistic like Coulrophobia. Spirit would be a character whose story isn't really a horror film, I would say, but more of a tragedy or even a drama, debatably, as it focuses on the collapse of the once great Yamaoka family and its estate, as Rin attempts to aid her father holding it all together. It would be a family drama almost, I think, ending with the ultimate tragedy of Rin's father murdering both his daughter Rin, but also his wife. I could see this getting some cult success as well, with it being a very small and intimate story ultimately. It does have a lot of tension, but not necessarily in the sense of big explosive moments or scenes, aside the very end, which would likely take the viewer off guard. Shattered Bloodline is also a pretty perfect title for this. Legion, I think, would actually be a very compelling story, although arguably not much happens in the way of action or violence. The huge moment I would debate in their lore is their murder of the store clerk. However, this would be a huge moment if it was built up too well in movie form, much like how it is in their lore, starting out with the building tensions of the four members and their lives, all being altered with the arrival of Frank to the small town of Ormond. From here we see them become friends and Julie and Frank lovers, eventually building up this idea of becoming killers or soldiers of mayhem, as they say. They cause chaos across the town, and it all comes to a head on that fateful night where they decide to go to Joey's old workplace and kill the clerk and bury him up Mount Ormond. A nice succinct title of a Legion would be great for this, I think, leaving the film on a cliffhanger at the end as we don't know what happens to the four of them after burying the body. This would be a pretty big success, I think. Plague would be an interesting one, and likely not so much a horror story, but more of a drama, as her story is more so focused on devotion and religion, and its horror elements largely come in through the presence of the entity. But even this is fairly subtle in her story. Her movie could focus on the plague itself largely that hits Babylon, Adiris's rise, and her subsequent attempts to save her people as she increases the number she sacrifices, and even makes drastic moves like cutting off her own toe. A story of a woman convinced by her god and its motives, and constantly trying to please it no matter the cost. Ending maybe with her death, but possibly with her arrival to the realm as well. A sign that despite the torment, all of it was, in a way, worth it. I could see this being a hit if it was modernized a bit. A good title would be Dark Devotion maybe, or just stick with the chapter name Demise of the Faithful, that's also really good. Oni's would be a bit of a hit, partly just down to the setting being pretty fascinating, set at the downfall of the samurai and having the protagonist as Kazan himself, someone who wants to cling onto his legacy. Oni's lore already works well honestly as a tragic tale of a man destroying his own legacy whilst trying to save it. It has key story beats and tragedy with the clash of himself and his father, leading to his death ultimately. Then also the lord who names Kazan Oni Yamaoka, an insult to his family and name, and one which causes him to rampage across Japan, and eventually rip the lord's tongue out, all to only fall to the masses of common folk that rise up to stop Kazan. It would be action-packed, tragic, and have an incredibly interesting setting and rich characters. I could see this being a real smash hit, especially with additional characters like Kazan's son, Akito. I know Oni's chapter is Curse Legacy, but I actually think Shattered Bloodline storyline works a bit better here as a title, or even just the Oni. Deathslinger I could see being a very popular story with wider audiences, and partly due to the setting of the Wild West. Caleb himself is also quite a compelling protagonist and isn't clearly bad or good, I would argue. Beginning with the heartbreaking moment of his inventions being stolen, the story could largely follow Caleb's days as a bounty hunter, working for the Hellshire Warden to pay off his prison time, ultimately discovering by the end that for all of his efforts he just ends up benefiting the same man who stole his inventions all those years ago. I think this could easily be a big success on the screen. The shootout at Dead Dog Saloon with the Mason Kelly gang would also likely be a very interesting moment to see. I could see this film being called either Chains of Hate or just Deathslinger. Blight, I would worry, would be awfully confusing to adapt into a movie. Whilst there's really great elements to his life and lore, I don't know if you could make a succinct and compelling film out of it. His life begins with him being fascinated by biology and chemistry, and ends with him clawing his way out of the void of the realm of an eldritch spider god. That's gonna be packed into 2 hours? It could begin and focus on his life as part of the East India Company, with him developing his serum, and then eventually going down the path of attempting to bridge into other dimensions and worlds. There's a lot of cool stuff there, but I'm not sure this type of thing would go mainstream. So cult classic maybe flop, honestly, just because of the overcomplication. I like the idea of calling this The Hunger though, after his Tome 1 entries. Twins I could see not getting the most attention and potentially being more of a cult classic. Their story is one wrought with tragedy and not all too much else, with the glimmer of hope they have slowly fading as the story goes on. It could take place following Charlotte, alone and hunted, reflecting on her life as she slowly freezes to death at the end of her lore, and remembers her brother and mother who died at the hands of her pursuers, but also the Black Veil, with the ending being when Victor mysteriously leaps out of the fog, coaxing Charlotte to follow him in. I quite like the name of their tome lore for the title, Side by Side. Trickster is a character I really do think would be successful in a movie format, especially as his story would be so appropriate and relevant to the modern day. A story that follows a boy who wishes to one day be famous, achieves everything he wanted, yet takes a dark turn, using this fame to prey on his own fans. The brightness and also popularity of K-pop would also make it a huge success, I think. The key story beats could be the studio fire that kills Trickster's no-spin bandmates, and causes Ji-woon to find his love for screams and noises of death, then his spree of close calls as Yoonjin slowly gets closer to figuring out the truth about him, all of it ending off with Trickster's magnum opus as he murders the board members of Mighty One and disappears forever. It could be a very stylized film, I think, or potentially even a great animated film, much like the trailers and such. It would be a smash hit, I think. All Kill is also a great title for it, or magnum opus would be good too. Artist is a character whose story is heavily influenced by the entity and its presence, but also the artistic representation of inner torment and tragedy. I could see Komina's film therefore being quite artsy and stylized, much like how it is in her written lore actually. It might not even be so much of a horror film, but maybe a thriller possibly, focusing on Komina's rebellion through her art against her oppressive government, a story where the audience would worry for her safety throughout the film. It could begin with the tragedy of her brother's death, and end with her at the graveyard where her hands and tongue are cut from her. I like the idea of just The Artist as the title, but Portrait of a Murder also goes insanely hard, of course. Dredge I could see being successful largely down to the character design, but also the focus of its story being on the freaky Garden of Joy cult. I could see this getting genuine and quite large mainstream success. Headed by a charismatic leader, Otto Stamper, we follow the Garden of Joy community, slowly unraveling the repressed darkness that they hold. There are clear moments of tension to pull on, like the murder of the journalist on stage, or the banishing of members who confess their inner darkness. It all comes crashing down at the end with the arrival of Dredge, a manifestation summoned from the community's repressed dark thoughts, which subsequently consumes them brutally and efficiently. It could be horrifying to see on screen, but also very successful, I think. Call it something simple like Dredge or Druani, or even go with the map name, Garden of Joy. Give it that culty feel. Night I think would actually make for a great movie, and would appeal pretty widely to audiences, with the medieval setting and large number of battles and altercations. The story's main focus could be on Knight winning his freedom from the Guardia Campania after his capture as a child, but as he achieves this, there's a tragic turning point where we could see that he has become a cruel and evil man in the process. This is where Vittorio could come in, and their whole storyline together occurs, with the climax of the film being the huge battle, where an army of good is raised to cleanse cleanse the evil of the Night from Portoscuro. You could also draw out some humanity within Night by having various scenes with him and his boys connecting over a fire or something like that, I don't know, chatting around a campfire. His film could be called just Forged in Fog, or maybe Cool to Arms after his add-on. I like that too. Skull Merchant I think is the most likely film to be a flop, and yeah, partly down to the fact that her lore was a flop for many people in DBD. Her story does lack consistency and a clear direction, with it focusing on the world of dark Brazilian manga. It's not exactly wide appeal. I could picture this largely focusing on Adriana's life and rise to riches, with the majority of the film focusing on her time as the Skull Merchant, as I think that's the part that would interest people the most, picking off CEOs. I could see the movie being called Sonhadoras Sombrias, the original name of the Skull Merchant manga, or again maybe just The Skull Merchant, as it's a pretty sort of quirky title. Singularity would present one of very few sci-fi offerings from DBD, however a great one. His story could be told from his perspective possibly, taking on a unique approach of following Hux from his days of literal creation in the factories of Java, all the way up to the moment he becomes sentient. Or it could go from Gabriel's perspective and his survival and endurance of Hux. It depends on whether it's a horror or more of a thriller or action type of film. For a horror focus it could be from Gabriel's perspective, for more action I would say from Hux's, as we hear about him slowly and brutally picking off the Devaka crew in his lore, destroying the crew's attempts to colonize the planet and breaking off all communication. I think it would probably function a bit better as a horror film, but also have elements of action and thriller. This would be a pretty huge hit I think, especially due to how compelling Hux is as a character. The movie could just be called The Singularity, or End Transmission, or even take one of the perk names and call it Genetic Limits. That could be cool. Unknown I think would be the clearest success for a film, with it having so many potential angles to approach or take it. It's also already got a banger title, with its chapter name being All Things Wicked. The story could focus primarily on a group of teenagers within Greenville as they slowly uncover the story and legend of the unknown, whilst investigating the disappearance of their friend. You could even have both Sable and Michaela be two of the main characters. By the time they figure out what it is though, it's too late. Unknown would be an incredible villain to see on screen, an unknowable, twisted creature with an amazing and iconic design that would scare basically all audiences, I think. I could definitely see this becoming a blockbuster hit. Houndmaster may seem unassuming, but she's honestly got one of the coolest and most expansive stories out of any of the killers. I do think it's got an interesting setting as well, being in the Caribbean. Portia becomes a pirate and has many adventures on her ship, which I'm sure many would enjoy. There's a clear tragedy to Portia's story too, with her father's murder opening the film, and her subsequent abandonment on a mysterious island that's home to an overlap would be a pretty fascinating thing to see on screen. All of it has a clear emotional through line too, with Portia's relationship with Snug, her dog. It creates an empathy for her despite the horrors she's causing. The final act could be her return to the seas, now a renowned pirate, and finally capturing the man who killed her father, Molak. I'm not sure it would quite be a blockbuster or something, due to it still having much more niche appeal I'd say, with Portia's distorted perspective and reality. I could see it getting some moderate success though for sure. No Quarter as a movie title name would go hard as well I think. Krasue I think has a rather basic story, and therefore it wouldn't see much success on the big screen, and would potentially work better as more of a short, arty type of film maybe. The core parts to Burong's story are her unhappiness with her current situation, the acceptance of the Krasue curse, and then finally achieving what she wanted and acknowledging the cost. This is a fine and solid structure, and the movie would definitely have some great moments, with the Krasue being a very visually engaging character. However, I do think this lack of narrative or development would result in the film struggling overall. Sinister Grace would be a banger title though. I'd say this would probably be a flop, maybe a cult classic, I don't know. Effective as character lore I think, but maybe not as a whole movie. Alright, well that's gonna do it. I do hope you enjoyed, and let me know which of the killer stories you think would make for the best movie down below. Oh, and hello to Mama Bo. Thanks for watching, and goodbye.